This is probably one of the most controversial opinions that I'm gonna share on the channel, and that is, I think that Fantasy Storm Petal Shirayuki is a perfect balanced designed card.
Stand up! Vanguard!
Shirayuki has been the topic of many people's discussion about if the card is a good addition for Vanguard, if it was a bad designed card and it makes the clan more toxic or more problematic. And we've seen a lot of people expressing this in different threads. Different people made even videos about it to discuss their concerns or their ideas or their opinion about this card. And in the wake of the latest ban list where this card was limited to 1, I think it's the perfect time to express my personal opinion about this card and why I think it's a well-designed card and why I think it should be used more in Vanguard to a wider scope, as it can bring the game to the next level. So to give a little bit of background information to understand where I'm coming from, Vanguard as a game is played in 2 different sides. We have the attacking front and we have the defending front, and the alterations between these 2 positions is what makes Vanguard a very unique game. As we have cards that can be used for an offensive play, we can put them onto the field, swing them sideways and put our opponent on the pressure. And then at the same time, our opponent can utilize those exact same cards, but then in a defensive strategy where they can place onto the board and use their shield value to basically prevent themselves from damaging or getting the 6 damage. And Vanguard has a whole plethora of cards that utilize different kinds of interactions, skills, and options to either help us with the offensive plays or with defensive plays. But the problem is, like 99.99% of the cards in Vanguard have a one-dimensional skill. And in this context, what I mean with that is that they either have a offensive ability or a defensive ability. And we do have skills with different layers and dimensions in their own specific regards of offensive or defensive, but we don't really have cards that utilize both fronts. We do have cards that try to assimilate this to a certain degree, but usually it's in a very lacking state. A good example is the latest Anastasia for Narukami, that was the old Perfect Guard. It has some offensive capabilities, but it's mainly used for a defensive options, and the offensive capabilities come from the fact that you can slam it onto the board and then still be able to intercept with it. But that isn't really enough. So we have offensive cards and we have defensive cards. And in their own nature, you should think, well, that's not really a big problem because you're going to build decks that have an equal amount of offensive cards as well as defensive cards, which allows you to make a good balanced deck. But the way how Vanguard is played, offensive cards will always be triumphant over defensive cards, because you're never going to win a battle if you're going to play defensively, as the point of the game is to put your opponent at 6 damage. We currently don't have any alternative win conditions outside very old strategies that were in Link Joker that could win in a specific way. And of course we have Gise, but Gise still wins through a 6 damage way instead of actually an alternate win condition. So with that in mind, we already are going to hinge more towards offensive cards, as they are going to allow us to win the game. Defensive cards are only used in a way when we have room to play them or we have some useful utility from them. And also a big problem is with most defensive cards is that their abilities are usually pretty mediocre, and we're also sacrificing a lot of offensive capabilities, as not only do we lose out on an offensive skill, these defensive cards typically have lower base power, which makes it even more detrimental to use them in a more offensive option. So that makes those defensive cards really lackluster and almost never see the light of day as just a generic beater, or a small increment of consistency is already outshining that extra shield value to a major degree. But of course, when we're talking about this subject, an important thing that we need to address are of course G-Guardians. These are the pinnacle of defensive cards in Vanguard. And the G-Guardians are on a different level because they not only typically just give a lot of shield value. The more and more advanced G-Guardians we got in the later stages of the G era, they also got more intricate skills that allows us to do different plays on our opponent's turn. And this is where we started to see more interactions and also more ways of getting a balanced card that have as well as defensive options as well as offensive options, as we got cards like the Now Griffin or Hate Around that could really control our opponent's boards while it still was their turn. But still the main problem is with G Guardians is that they aren't actually a offensive and a defensive card in one single card. G Guardians are still 100% defensive cards, and the main issue why we actually play them is because they are in the G zone, a extra deck. We don't have to sacrifice offensive options to run these defensive cards, because we're already going to run heal triggers, so we already have access to them, and we're never going to access 16 different strides. Games don't tend to go that long, so we have room to at least put 4 G Guardians into our G zone. So we're not really sacrificing any offensive capabilities to play this card, so it's only an addition to our defensive capabilities, and that makes them so strong. If G Guardians were forced to be run into the main deck, we'd probably see much less of these G Guardians in actual play, because those cards don't have any offensive capabilities. So where G Guardians are an upgrade of defensive cards, they aren't really still addressing the issue of the offensive versus defensive mindset. And the whole mindset of offensive versus defensive is where Vanguard could shine if they utilize these two options and combine them to a single entity. And what I mean with that is basically cards that do have an offensive capability as well as a defensive capability. We already see this in the generic vanilla cards. Vanilla cards have the offensive options of just having the base power and they can slam into your opponent, but they also have a higher shield value, so they have the shield value of defensive capability. So in the very generic sense of Vanguard, every card has an offensive capability as well as a defensive option. They have shield value and an attack power. But if we're gonna take this to the next step and also give cards an offensive ability as well as a defensive ability, then we can enter a whole new era of Vanguard. And this is where we all pin back to Shirayuki, as Shirayuki is exactly the embodiment of this philosophy of having an offensive card as well as an defensive card in one single entity, as her ability is a very elegant way of incorporating these two ideas in one single skill, as her ability can be used on an offensive capability during your turn on the Vanguard as well as Vanguard Circle, but can also be used in a defensive way when guarding with it. And that makes the card very flexible in all kinds of ways, and we see how strong such an effect can be if utilized in a right way, because you want to play this card because it gives you so many options. If this ability was only usable during the defensive state, you probably won't see as much as Shirayuki as we've seen in the past year, because it's also as good as it is because we can use it in an offensive setting. If that capability was removed from the card, it was a much weaker card than it was, and probably would not see that many tops with the deck with different strategies like Zanbaku or Hyuga. Same as when we spin it around and we remove the defensive options, because the defensive option of the card allows the deck to stay alive long enough to do its thing for Zanbaku and Hyuga, etc. But the main problem why the whole mindset of a lot of people was that this card was toxic or bad for the game or wasn't basically a good design card is that Bushiroad stopped after this card. If they made Shirayuki and then a couple of sets later made another Shirayuki type card for a different clan and did that throughout different sets for different clans, then the whole mindset of Shirayuki is too strong will slowly dwindle away, because more clans have access to this type of value, which gives more clans an equal footing in the meta, which then suddenly makes Shirayuki less oppressive. And sure, we have the Shirayuki support cards and all, but I only want to take a look at Shirayuki herself, as the support cards are its own entity and its own thing, and I only want to take a look at the specific skill of Shirayuki herself that makes it an offensive as well as a defensive card. And the reason why I can assume that if they allowed more of these type of cards in different clans will equal out the playing field, is that we have seen this happen in time and time before, when certain strong archetypes or decks came out that were dominating, and people thought, well, this needs to be nerfed because it's way too strong, and if we give more clans access to this power, it will just be insane. But the moment they did that, then suddenly nobody was looking back at those insane decks at the time that was overpowering, because everybody already caught up and it doesn't really seem that all impressive anymore. A good example is Time Leap. We have been long gone in and catched up to Time Leap and went past it, and nobody's really talking about it anymore because its heyday is way back in time. It's unrestricted in full capacity, so you can utilize it in its full glory, but still wouldn't do as much as it did back then, because all the other clans and decks have been caught up to it and surpassed it in power level and what it can do. This would be the same if we incorporate more like Shirayuki cards for other clans. And the reason why I personally am advocating for such a card is that I personally, when fighting up against a Murakuma player, I really like the Shirayuki matchup. The idea that I have a Shirayuki in hand allows me to have a completely different mindset than at any other opponent. Because at that point, I'm trying to figure out, alright, what is the best course of action? Do I want to take it more defensively, so they're going to use the Shirayuki for an offensive play, so I can then come in swinging the following turn because they lost the defensive option? Or do I want to go very aggressive now, so I force them out to use the Shirayuki, use their soul, so their offensive turn, the following turn, is going to be a lot less oppressive for me because they don't have a Shirayuki access to them in that specific attack wave. And all these decisions and these ideas come out because a single card can be used as well as offensively as defensively. So I, as an opponent, then need to start thinking about, do I want them to force that card in an offensive setting, or do I rather have them use it in a defensive setting? And this could never be a thought pattern if every single card is just either an offensive card or a defensive card, because you're already going to know, alright, he's going to use this card for this situation and he's going to use that card for that situation. I need to get rid of those specific cards if I want to win the game. But if a card is flexible, then it's suddenly a different story, because now you're trying to force them out a certain card in a less optimal way, and now you're thinking about, how can I force them to go for that less optimal play to have my optimal play? And this is the same thought pattern that you have in Premium with G-Guardians, because G-Guardians are somewhat are a stepping stone to this idea, because sure, they are pure defensive cards, but with the interactions they have, they can be utilized in specific situations. And now your opponent is trying to force your opponent from using the G-Guardians in the less optimal situation for them, so you get the best situation out of it. And that's why I personally think that Shirayuki, with her specific Vanguard Rearguard the Guardian Circle skill, is one of the best designed cards in Vanguard, because it allows you to play in a completely different way. It allows you to play offensively as well as defensively with a single card, and your opponent has way more things to think about when facing up against a Shirayuki card, because now they have things to think about if they want to force that card defensively, offensively. Do they want to go in a specific attack pattern to minimize the value of a defensive Shirayuki, or they want to go for a different kind of field so the offensive Shirayuki won't be as effective, which gives the game as a whole way more layers to it and makes a high level play all the more rewarding when winning against certain cards. And I actually personally hope they're gonna do this more often in the future, where cards actually have an offensive as well as a defensive skill, and not like something like Anastasia, where yes, you can slam it onto the board to boost with it or tag with it, and then you can intercept with it for her shield value. Those are very one-dimensional skills. That is not what I mean with this. I mean exactly how Shirayuki is worded, how Shirayuki is used. A single skill, and it can be two separate skills, that allows it to be used offensively, but also in a separate way, using it as a defensive tool. This gives the player way more things to think about if I want to call this thing to the Rearguard Circle to use it in a specific way, or they want to save it in hand and then call to the Guardian Circle to get more value out of a specific guard situation. But that's basically my opinion about Shirayuki's skill design. Now I want to know what you guys think about the idea of having more offensive and defensive abilities in one single card. Do you like the idea of have more increase in defensive capabilities of your current Vanguard decks, as most Vanguard decks are like 99% about offensive capabilities? You don't really think about defensive options. The only defensive options that you have are your perfect guards, your triggers, and your shield value on your separate cards. But what about the idea of having your offensive cards to also have an additional defensive skill, which makes you think twice before calling a card to the field, as you are also losing out on this very potential strong defensive option? And take Shirayuki as an example for that. So let me know in the comments down below all your thoughts and opinions about this topic, and maybe you have a good suggestion or idea for a specific skill design that incorporates these two philosophies of offensive capabilities as well as defensive capabilities. Last week we talked about the idea of restricting gift marker types with specific units in either a new restriction type for Bushiroad's ban list, or in a way to balance out new powerful skills where a player can only use a specific gift marker if they want to get access to a specific skill of a card. And you guys have some interesting things to say about, and Mitch had a very interesting idea about, instead of just outright limiting a effect by having a specific marker, why not incorporate the idea that we've seen with Great Nature, with the gacha mechanic, where a specific skill states if you have type 1, do X, and if you have type 2, do Y. And it's an interesting idea as it allows you as a player to have more options available to you in how you want to play a card, and also it opens a bit more deck designing, as with the initial idea of just outright not being able to use a skill, it will restrict you in deck designing to some capacity, but addressed in that video, it also will open up more deck building options as you're now challenged the way to build your deck. But allowing you to have X and Y gives a card more flexibility and more options, and it could be a very powerful unit if such a thing would ever be incorporated in the game, as it allows you to go two different routes in playstyles. And it depends on the supporting cards if you either have a deck that splits up entirely in two different options, or you're going to have a very generic support base, and this specific unit will dedicate in which direction the whole strategy of the build is going towards when you're going for your type 1 or type 2 marker. Thanks, I really do like this watch as well. I got it gifted to me from last Christmas, and I usually don't tend to wear watches all that often, as they tend to randomly break on me, and it has to do with high blood pressure. It runs in my family, and after watching some animes, I got PTSD of watches that suddenly stopped ticking.
あれ、眉毛の懐中止まっちゃってる。おかしいな。さっきネジ巻いたばっかりなのに。
A lot of you guys also pointed out that the idea of restricting a certain gift marker with a archetype or a deck strategy is already inactive with the whole Angel Feathers support cards from the latest set, but also with the Witches cards from Miyagi Academy. And to some degree, you're right, because they are forcing you to play with Protect 1 or Protect 2, but it's not exactly what I meant with the video, because those restrictions don't specifically state that you need to have Protect 1 or Protect 2, as the Angel Feather cards are stating if there's a Protect marker in the same column, and the Witches card for Oracle Think Tank states that you need to show a Protect marker from hand. So if we ever going to get type 3, 4, 5, whatever new types that are working in the same vein as Protect 1 or Protect 2, they will still synergize with the Angel Feather cards or with the Witches for Oracle Think Tank. And what I personally were more referring to were cards that are specifically stating that you need to have type 1, type 2, type 3, or type X of marker to get that specific skill live. So if we ever get new markers that work in a similar vein as those other markers, it won't interact with that skill, as it were specifically asking for type X marker. So it's a little bit different than I exactly meant, but it's in the same vein with the Angel Feathers and Oracle Think Tank cards, that it's somewhat restricting you at what type of marker you can use to utilize the power potential of those cards. Fire Blaster 40, I think if they go the full mile by restricting specific clans with markers, I think that will backfire for the game as a whole, because we already are able to use these markers for every different clan, but then just outright limiting a specific marker for a clan just because, I don't think that's a good way to either balance the game or adding more interactions, because you're actually limiting interactions. You're actually removing new options from clans because you're now stating, yeah, you can no longer use this because. And I don't think that's a good idea. I think the idea of restricting things for specific cards or clans can open up more ways of playstyles, is only if it is used in a limited fashion. So not clan-wide, but maybe archetype-wide or card-wide or support set-wide. So there is a difference in than just outright limiting or restricting or banning a specific thing for an entire clan. I think that is going a little bit overboard. And especially if you already stated out yourself, certain markers are stronger than other markers, and by restricting a specific stronger marker for another clan, you're effectively making that clan weaker for no apparent reason. But that's basically everything for today. Let me know in the comments down below what your opinions and thoughts are about the idea of having offensive as well as defensive options in a single card, and what type of skills can come out of that as well for specific clans. As always, this video has been brought to you by our lovely patrons over at patreon.com/Vanguard Insider. You guys are amazing. If you do want to support the channel or everything that's happening on the channel, then head over to patreon.com/Vanguard Insider and become a patron today. With that said, I'm Mr. Timeleap, and I see you guys in the next one!